This painting captures the moment that a revolution beginning with hope started to descend into a phase of horrifying bloodshed. But for the man in the painting, Jean-Paul Marat, violence had been a tool of necessity. One of the leading voices of the French Revolution in the 1790s, there were few who advocated for radical action louder than he did. Backed by much of the Parisian lower classes, or the sans-culottes, Marat was one of the fiercest voices in the Jacobin political club, and in their corresponding group in the French Parliament, the Montagnards. His assassination would become a tale woven in irony. A radical agitating for violence, assassinated in his own bathtub by a woman who wished to prevent bloodshed, but instead helped unleash horrors that would scar the French Revolution forever. For the Jacobins simply could not tolerate any semblance of counter-revolution, and in the months after Marat's death, they carried out a rampage that would seal their reputation as one of the most notorious political movements of the early modern period. When Marat died, the Reign of Terror began. Today we look at the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, the revolutionary whose life was ended by the relentless violence that he himself had helped to create. Who was Jean-Paul Marat, and why did his fiery rhetoric stand out in the sea of chaos that characterised the French Revolution? Originally a doctor, Marat spent the 1770s and 80s writing intensely on the fields of medicine, science and philosophy. After spending some time building up his reputation in London, he returned to France in 1777 a man in demand, gaining clients from among the elites of French society. Although he was successful as a doctor, in 1783 he quit to work on his academic writings full time. He gained some recognition, but this wasn't quite enough for Marat, who now wanted to rub shoulders with the intellectual elites as well. Although desperate to have his work recognised and endorsed by the Academy of Sciences, his relationship with them quickly turned sour, and they would not do so. Marat had hit a glass ceiling. His frustrations started to grow, and coupled with a resentfulness at the condition of French society and politics in general, he fell into a mindset of self-victimization bordering on martyrdom. This rejection perhaps changed something in Marat, for his views began to evolve, and he gradually began to slide down a path laced with increasingly extreme radicalism. But importantly for Marat, he was far from the only one who harboured this resentment. Millions of others were also becoming restless, particularly the Parisian lower classes who came to be known as the sans-culottes. As France headed towards a storm, Marat stood by with his quill, ready to rain fuel onto the fire. In 1789, the simmering anger amongst the French population erupted. The revolution began in earnest, the Bastille fortress was stormed, and the absolute power of the monarchy began to crumble. Seeing angry people whose fuses he could light with his political writings, Marat began publishing his newspaper, The Friend of the People. This publication, more than anything, offers a window into Marat's radical ideology and violent agitations. The Friend of the People was ferocious and unforgiving. Although advocating for concepts that seem normal today, such as the political equality of all citizens, it also launched venomous attacks on both the monarchy and on Marat's most hated enemy, the aristocracy. As a matter of fact, his writings were so inflammatory that he had to spend time hiding in the sewers of Paris, and at one point even fled the country to avoid arrest. In the eyes of Marat, violence was the key to the revolution, the only tool to prevent the old powers from restoring the former regime that was now being withered away. Accordingly, he called upon the sans-culottes to use preemptive violence against these figures to protect the gains so far achieved. He proclaimed to his readers, 500 or 600 heads cut off would have assured your repose, freedom, and happiness. A false humanity has held your arms and suspended your blows. Because of this, millions of your brothers will lose their lives. As he was not physically involved in some of the revolution's bloodiest moments, it's somewhat difficult to quantify exactly how much responsibility his writings held on them. However, they have been held at least partially accountable for fueling horrors such as the Champ de Mars massacre of 1791 and the September massacres of 1792. Such was the fear he was creating amongst both his enemies and even some of the revolution's more moderate leaders that at one point his printing presses were destroyed by police. but his provocations remained popular. When the monarchy was brought down, in 1792 he was elected to the parliament of the brand new French Republic, the National Convention. One of the most radical deputies in there, Marat became part of the convention's left-wing bloc, the Montagnards, drawn from the increasingly radical Jacobin club. Sat opposite them were the more moderate Girondins, their former Jacobin allies. Whilst both groups were revolutionary, the Girondins were keen to avoid a slide towards authoritarian and centralised government, whereas the radical Montagnards ran headlong into it. Witnessing what he deemed to be cowardice, Marat's acid tongue found a new target. For anyone unwilling to stretch towards the extreme end of radicalism was a potential counter-revolutionary. Fed up with Marat's constant attacks on them and worried about the direction in which the revolution was now heading, in April 1793 the Girondins arrested Marat and put him before a revolutionary tribunal. However, after delivering an impassioned defence in front of a large crowd of supporters, he was cleared of the charges of inciting violence and threatening to undermine the convention. It was a huge blow to the Girondins' prestige. Ironically, having just been cleared of these charges, Marat now prepared for the ultimate revenge. His speeches in the convention intensified in their hatred of the Girondins. Partly as a result of this, in early June a mob of radicals surrounded the convention and arrested 29 Girondin representatives, with the guillotine just around the corner. All of these murderous episodes would foreshadow the terror of what was to follow later. It was as if during any act of revolutionary mass violence, the silhouette of Marat was there observing in the background, admiring the influence that his writings were having. However, the Girondins were not quite as defeated as Marat thought, and it was this very real threat of a deeper delve into depravity that one young woman was desperate to prevent. By the summer of 1793, Marat's influence was being felt more than ever. The Girondins were gone, the revolution was turning more radical, and the sans-culottes still gave him their backing. But in an ironic twist, the revolutionary was about to get a taste of the political violence that he had so often cried out for. Around this time, his health took a bad turn. A skin disease he suffered from was now worsening, perhaps aggravated by the periods he had previously spent hiding from his enemies in the sewers. In his constant pain, he was forced to the confines of his home, communicating with the convention mainly via letters. To his enemies, he was now a sitting duck, and one young woman, incensed at the fate of the Girondins, was about to use this to her advantage. Her name was Charlotte Corday, and she was about to conduct one of the most shocking acts of the revolution. Despite coming from an aristocratic background, the well-educated Corday was nonetheless a staunch Republican. Having supported the revolution's early reforms that were fueled by the ideas of the Enlightenment, she came to see the moderate Girondins as the natural leaders of a new France, one that was progressive and stable. It was to her horror that the revolution began to spiral down a radical path. She watched helplessly as the Montagnards, and more broadly the Jacobins, escalated their incitements of murderous violence that soon found its way to her own city of Caen. And who embodied this violence more than Marat? Corday already hated him from her belief that he had incited the September massacres. His role in purging the Girondins was simply the final straw. Marat had to die. Having travelled to Paris, Corday hoped to kill Marat at the July 14th celebrations. After discovering that he was unwell and effectively homebound, her job became even easier. Arriving at Marat's home on the morning of July 13th, Corday was told that he was too ill to receive visitors and was promptly sent away, but she would not give up that easily. Returning that evening claiming to have news of Girondin traitors that were active in Caen, Marat overheard and ignored his fiancée's concerns, inviting in Corday himself. As she ventured into the house, she came to find Marat sitting in the herbal bath that he now virtually lived in to try and relieve his skin pain, using a wooden board as a writing desk. The two spoke for 15 minutes, ending with Corday giving Marat a list of the apparent Girondin traitors. Looking through the names, Marat replied, "Good. In a few days I will have them all guillotined." But his reign of violence was now over. For immediately after this, Corday drew a 5-inch knife from her dress and plunged it into Marat's body. His fiancée would hear the revolutionary let out a harrowing scream, but by the time she had rushed to his aid, it was too late. His bathwater now a deep crimson colour, Jean-Paul Marat, the most radical voice of the revolution, was dead. Meanwhile, Corday made no attempt to escape. She believed that with Marat gone, the fuel behind the violence had now been eliminated, and the revolution could be calmed down. But little did she know that partly through her actions, the revolution was instead about to sink to a level of horror never seen before. News of Marat's assassination soon spread, and Corday was put on trial. She told the Montagnards interrogating her that she had acted alone, travelling to Paris for the sole purpose of killing Marat for how he had poisoned the revolution. But what was most shocking of all to her interrogators and the general public was the idea that a woman had committed this murder on her own. They believed that surely it had been a man's idea and Corday was just a pawn in a wider conspiracy. Although the courts did their utmost to force her to admit that this was a larger Girondin plot, no such admission was forthcoming. She took pride in the fact that she and she alone had taken down one of the great monsters of the revolution, saying, "I have killed one man to save 100,000. With her guilt confirmed, she was guillotined on July 17th at the age of 24, just 3 days after the assassination. But if she died believing that she had pulled the revolution back from the brink of a bloodbath, she was sadly mistaken. 1793 had already witnessed the execution of the king and the fall of the Girondins, and now, just 2 months after Marat's murder, the period known as the Reign of Terror would be unleashed. This campaign of arrests, purges, and mass murder would mark the bloodiest phase of the entire revolution. It was perpetrated by a group within the National Convention ironically named the Committee of Public Safety, dominated by the now radical Jacobins and their Montagnard deputies. The best known committee member was a man named Maximilien du Robespierre, an ally of Marat. It must be said that the thousands of necks upon which the guillotines fell during the Terror had not been put into action by Marat's death alone. The Committee of Public Safety were already paranoid from a royalist revolt in the west and a war with Austria in the east, and were seeing internal enemies everywhere. However, Marat's murder by a Girondin sympathiser did help fuel the Jacobin narrative of counter-revolution, and made him a martyr to the sans-culottes and Montagnard radicals. All of this resulted in a murderous reign of violence that even Marat could barely have envisioned in all his years of provocative agitations. One of history's first examples of coordinated state terror, it was so brutal that it is actually where the English word terrorism originates from, first being used in 1795. This rampage of death would last a whole 10 months, before a group of moderate Montagnards arrested Robespierre and sent him to the guillotine. The Jacobin Club was closed down, and at long last, the terror was over. The tale of Jean-Paul Marat's assassination was one steeped in irony. A revolutionary killed by the venom of his own rhetoric. A woman hoping to save the revolution who instead poured fuel onto the fire. And most of all, how one extreme hunt for enemies of the people gave birth to one of the most evil concepts of all, state terrorism. A Pandora's box opened by Marat and his revolutionary allies that humanity has never managed to recover from. As always, we hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more from the Assassinations Archive.